Today we're doing another rebinding project. This time it is Tamora Pierce's Protector of the Small. So a few weeks ago I rebound the Song of the Lioness quartet, and I wanted to do the Protector of the Small in like a similar, complementary but not exactly matching way. So this is what I wound up doing. So of course I started by tearing apart the text block and adding the end papers. I only filmed for one of the books for this one, but the process is the same for all of them. For the end papers for this one, I'm using just cardstock that I foiled a quote from each of the books on. So I glued those in place, and then it was time to sew my end bands. So you might notice that for this project, I'm using the perfect bound paperback editions of the books. And the only reason I'm doing this is because I literally could not find a sewn binding edition of these books anywhere. They are just not out there nearly as much as books like Lord of the Rings, so a lot harder to find. So while I do prefer to use the higher quality sewn bindings, it just wasn't really an option for these ones, so I'm using the paperbacks. I still like to sew my own end bands though. I just think it's a whole extra touch that I don't want to skip, and it works fine on a paperback binding. It's just structurally the book probably won't be quite as sound as a sewn binding. So I sewed with this blue and silver shiny thread for this one. I'm kind of going with the blue and gray theme and silver for this set of books. Whereas for the Alana books, I definitely went with purple and gold. Then I added a bit of mull to reinforce the spine and let that dry. And then it was time to move on to my covers. So I designed all of these covers based off of the spines lining up when it's on the shelf. So it was quite finicky to get these all lined up perfectly. So I designed the spines first, and then I took those over and extrapolated that design onto the front and back cover. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I just created it into a cut file so that I could cut it all out in one piece on chipboard. I also cut the line that shows where that white leather is going to go across. I just have that scored into the chipboard, and it helps me to line up the leather really, really well when I'm putting it on, so that I don't have to guess and I don't have to measure, and everything just lines up perfectly. I always finish the cut by hand, and then I also cut out the circle where the shield is going to go later on. So I assembled this all into the cover, taped it together, and then it was time to put on the leather. At first I'm just using one thin layer of chipboard, and then later on, once I'm done the cover completely, I added another piece of 1mm chipboard to the back so that it ends up being a little bit thicker. But you'll see why I only use the thin chipboard to start with, because I'm going to do some sewing, and I cannot sew through 2mm of chipboard. That would be a nightmare. It's hard enough doing it just through this thin piece. So I start with this, and then I reinforce it at the very end after. And adding the chipboard at the end also helps smooth out any lines from the embroidery that I'm going to do in a few minutes here. So I started with doing the leather, and I already had those lines scored onto the chipboard, so I knew exactly where to glue each color. I made sure to glue this on really, really well. I used PVA to be really strong so it's not going to move. Applying the white was the hardest because I had to kind of cut it while it was in place to get it exact with where those lines were, but it ended up working out pretty nicely. And I also made sure to really push together the seams of the leather. Even though I'm going to be doing some sewing on this, it's not really structural, it's more just design, so it doesn't really help to hold the leather and keep it from gaping. So I made sure that I push the leather together really well so there's not going to be any cracks where you're going to see the chipboard down the road. And it's time to punch some holes for the sewing. So I used an awl for this, and I have no idea where I got this. It came in some random box of sewing supplies that I bought once. This was actually a really slow process, but I needed to pre-punch the holes. When I went in and sewed later on, it wasn't so hard to push the needle through the chipboard and the leather. And I measured these out at 1/8 of an inch between each hole so that everything is nice and uniform. And then I went in and sewed, and as you can imagine, this took a really long time, especially to do for 4 books. I really loved this cover design until I had to sew 4 lines of thread for every single cover. But at the end, I was really happy with how it turned out. And I really love the neat little rows of stitching. I think that they're really pretty. Once my cover was stitched, I did add a little bit of paper just so that the seams on the hinges are going to be glued together well, so that there won't be any gaping when the book is being opened and closed. So that's what I'm doing here, and just pushing everything in together really well. Then it was time to go in for my foiling. So I'm using my Silhouette Curio, and I lined this up very, very carefully on my cutting mat. I'm using a hot foil pen and hot foil for this. You kind of have to make sure everything is nice and straight for this, because you can't really go back later on. I did figure out during this project how to remove the foil if I needed to, but it's really hard to do it perfectly without ever seeing that happened, so I prefer not to. So I just like to make sure everything is nice and straight. And then because my book cover was just like a tiny little bit too big, I had to reposition it to do the bottom half of the design because I couldn't fit it all quite on one mat. So I did it again and peeled that away, and it looks so pretty. And then once all my foiling was done, it was time to do my turn-ins around the edges. So I cut the corners and then glued and folded these all together. As you can see, I've now added that second piece of chipboard to the cover to add that extra thickness. And then it'll be nice and smooth on my end papers once everything is cased together. And then it was time to do the shields. So I have some kind of thin silver metal that I'm going to use for this shield. So I cut out the stencils on permanent vinyl. There's 4 different shield designs. The shield for the last book is Kel's actual knight's shield. And then for the other books, I just designed patterns that I thought kind of went with the books. She's depicted in them. I have like her horse, her dog, her sparrows, her griffin, those kind of things that kind of go with the book. If you read the books, hopefully you will get what we're looking at. Luckily this metal is pretty thin, so I could just kind of cut this out with scissors, peel off the stencils after I had spray painted it, and then I have these cute little shields. I'm really happy with how these turned out. I think they're really cool. And then I did add a clear coat to the top of them just to kind of give it an extra sealing so that the paint isn't going to chip away. And then I forgot to film the casing in process, so hopefully you've seen that before. I always seem to forget to film that part. But the last step was to apply the acrylic sealant to the leather. I used lambskin for these books. It's about a little less than 1 millimeter thick, and it's quite delicate, so using the acrylic sealer really helps to give it a little bit more toughness. These are books that are meant to be read, put in shelf, dragged in and out and stuff like that, so I don't want them falling apart. So even though I do use really thin, supple, delicate leather, I find that this sealant does a good job of making them a little more hardy. And then also because I'm using this heat foil, I want to use a sealer as well, just to make sure that none of that foil is going to rub off with use. And I just roughed up the back of the shield and glued it in place with a bit of contact cement, and then pressed it for a while, and then we are done. And here are some pictures of the final product. I'm really happy with how these turned out. I'm obsessed with the cute little lines of stitching. I don't know why, but that's my favorite thing right now. I think they are extremely labor intensive, but they look very pretty in the end. And these did a really good job of complementing but not exactly matching the Alana books on my shelf. So I kind of want to do the rest of Tamara Pierce's series. The hardest part is finding books of hers that I'm willing to tear apart, because a lot of them are really hard to actually get your hands on in the first place. So as I go hunting through thrift stores and eBay and all those kind of things, I will hopefully get around to the rest of her series eventually. And if you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.